I'm Jonathan Braylock.
I'm Gerard Milligan.
And I'm James III. And we're the hosts of Black Men Can't Jump in Hollywood. It's a comedic podcast that reviews films with leading actors of color and analyzes them in the context of race and Hollywood's diversity issues.
Yeah. Listen to new episodes on Mondays. Find us wherever you get your podcasts.
I don't care where you get them. I just want you to listen.
Don't threaten the people. We need them to listen.
Oh, okay. Sorry, guys. Listen to us. Yay.
Yeah, put on a happy voice.
What more can I say? You know what it is.
Black men can't jump.
Hey everybody, it's Tim Heidecker. You know me, Tim and Eric, Bridesmaids, and Fantastic Four. I'd like to personally invite you to listen to Office Hours Live with me and my co-hosts, DJ Doug Pound.
Hello.
And Vic Berger.
Howdy.
Every week we bring you laughs, fun, games, and lots of other surprises. It's live. We take your Zoom calls.
Music.
We love having fun. Excuse me?
Songs. Vic said something.
Songs.
Music.
I like having fun. I like to laugh. I like to meet people who can make me laugh. Please subscribe now.
The following podcast includes explicit language, including, well, you'll just have to wait and see.
Hi, I'm Josh Levine, and this is Hang Up and Listen for the week of May 22nd, 2023. On this week's show, we'll talk about two teams on the verge of sweeps in the NBA Conference Finals and two players who are dominating the playoffs, the Heat's Jimmy Butler and the Nuggets' Nikola Jokic. Writers Dave Zirin and Jesse Washington will also join us to assess Jim Brown, the football legend, civil rights activist, and domestic abuser, who died last week at age 87. And finally, Defector's Maitreyi Anantharaman will be here to discuss Brittney Griner's return, Becky Hammon's suspension, and what's in store for the WNBA this season. I'm in Washington, D.C., and I'm the author of The Queen and the host of the podcast 1 Year. Also in D.C. is Stefan Fatsis. He's the author of Word Freak. A few seconds of panic and Wild and Outside. Hello, Stefan.
Hi, Josh. How was your week?
Good. Thank you. You're implying that we didn't talk since last week, that we just went into our cryogenic chambers and have only now emerged to encounter each other on this Zoom.
There's private talk and then there's hang up talk. Everyone who's listening didn't hear us talk when we talked. They're only hearing us talk now.
How was your week?
It was good. Thank you for asking, Josh. Picked up my daughter at college, played a little softball. Watched one of my Scrabble players graduate from college, even though he's only in high school. Long story. Watched a high school baseball game. Full week.
How was Joel Anderson's week?
Don't know. He's not on the show. He's busy, isn't he?
I think it was a busy week. Slow Burn Season 8 Becoming Justice Thomas is coming next week, baby. May 31st. Listen for that. In our Slate Plus segment this week, Maitreyi Anantharaman of Defector will stick around to talk more about the WNBA, including why do so many draft picks not make opening day rosters, and how can the WNBA fix that? To hear us discuss, you need to be a Slate Plus member. You get bonus segments on our show. It's called Hang Up and Listen. Also, on other Slate shows, you get ad-free shows, and you get to support us. Slate.com/hangupplus is the link to sign up. Slate.com/hangupplus. On Sunday night in Miami, Jason Tatum led the Boston Celtics with 14 points. Among the Heat players who outscored him were Caleb Martin, who was not drafted, Duncan Robinson, who was not drafted, and Gabe Vincent, who scored 29. Was he drafted? He was not. The final score was 128-102. The Heat are up 3-0 in the series. And after the game, Gabe Vincent talked to the Inside the NBA crew about how Miami is not going to get complacent.
You know, they're a really good team. They're a well-coached team. They got stars. They're not going to lay down. So, we we got to come in and handle business on Tuesday.
Yeah, clearly you didn't watch the game tonight. Yep. Talk about well-coached and don't lay down.
Don't lay down,
go look at the tape again. Easy. He can't answer that.
Stefan, Jimmy Butler also outscored Jason Tatum in Game 3, but only with 16, and he didn't have to do that much with all those other dudes raining threes. Game 2 was a different story. In that one, Butler led Miami from down 9 with less than 7 minutes to go after the Celtics' Grant Williams started talking shit to him. Not a good idea with Jimmy Butler.
Josh, you didn't mention that Jimmy Butler was, in fact, drafted late in the first round of the NBA draft. The Heat had more undrafted players play 20-plus minutes on Sunday than they did drafted players. That's ridiculous. But is there anything better than shit-talking payback in the NBA, especially when it comes from Jimmy Butler? The Heat closed out that game 2 that you mentioned with a 24-9 run after he and Grant Williams rubbed foreheads. But that wasn't enough for Jimmy Butler. In game 3, he reminded everyone that the beef was still cooking when he drew contact from Williams on a drive, banked in a falling down shot, and then while lying on his back, pointed dramatically at Grant Williams. Later in the game, he dived into his memory bank all the way back to game 1, when after making a 3, Al Horford dropped to a knee and flashed a timeout sign at the Miami players in game 3. After Vincent sank a 3 to put Miami up by 20-something points, Butler squatted, backpedaled to half court, flashing his index fingers, and then stopped to make a big old timeout signal. I just don't know if I'm the best person to talk to, Butler said. He is really awesome, unpredictable, unapologetic, smart, self-aware, fun, always willing to call out teammates and call bullshit, which he did a lot at previous stops in the NBA, Josh.
Yeah, I think in those previous spots, there are some people who would dispute the notion that he is quote unquote fun. But I think he's always been fun if you are not a fan of any of those teams or are a neutral fan. He's a guy who makes the game, broadly speaking, and the games that he plays in more exciting. And he's also one of these players who I think kind of like Kobe Bryant in a way. I would take note during some of these games that he actually doesn't make every shot in the clutch. It only seems like he does, but he has this reputation, and I think kind of a deserved one for quote unquote never missing in the clutch. He always seems, even though he doesn't always, capable of making these shots. And he always, maybe it's because he always lets you know when he does make them. The thing that's so fascinating about this Heat team, and I thought this tweet by Tom Ziller really illustrated it, is this is the Heat starting 5 per game scoring average when they were rookies. Jimmy Butler, 2.6. Gabe Vincent, 2.4. Bam Adebayo, 6.9. Max Strus, 2.5. And then Kevin Love, who was only able to play a couple minutes on Sunday, 11.1. Here's the backups as rookies. Caleb Martin, 6.2. Kyle Lowry, 5.6. Cody Zeller, 6.0. Duncan Robinson, 3.3. This is team player development. But this is also, the thing that's confounding about them is that even successful teams in the playoffs, like the Nuggets, the rotation shortens, right? There are guys who are, like Ben Golliver was telling us, 82-game players, guys who have a skill that makes them, succeed or be playable in the regular season. And in the playoffs, when the game changes, they're not able to play. I think of Christian Brown for the Nuggets on Saturday, the rookie. He's had a pretty good season. He comes in for about 15 seconds, screws up, and is just glued to the bench the rest of the game. That's like a thing that happens in the playoffs. For the Heat, you got guys like Duncan Robinson, who were glued to the bench for the entire regular season, are now like scoring 20 plus and looking like stars. You got to credit Eric Spoelstra, the coach, obviously. But I'm curious what you think of the whole Heat culture thing and how much of that is a sort of magical thinking and how much of it, just given what we've seen over many years now, feels like something real that we can actually put our fingers on.
I mean, it's not magical thinking. It's magical thinking only in as much as they're doing well. Therefore, we are paying attention to it. And as for someone like Duncan Robinson being glued to the bench during the regular season, a lot of the change in the playoffs is due to the fact that the Heat lost their leading scorer for the regular season, Tyler Hero, early in the first round of these playoffs. There's had to have been an urgency among the coaching staff and the rest of the team to figure out what to do. And that part clearly is attributable to Eric Spoelstra. They weren't even supposed to, they barely made the playoffs. They lost the first play-in game. They came back to win the second playoff game, and they have looked unstoppable despite losing their number one scorer. So if culture is a real thing in sports, and it clearly is, how much of that does redound to Spoelstra's coaching and Jimmy Butler's leadership, I would imagine. This is a guy that is pretty outspoken, that tells teammates what he thinks, that was not shy about telling the public that he thought that his teammates on the Minnesota Timberwolves sucked and weren't trying hard when they practiced and played. And it led to him being traded after 13 games of the season in which he called everybody out. He ended up getting traded to Philadelphia and things went slightly better, but it wasn't as if he was patting everyone on the head when he left that team. So if a player like Jimmy Butler, who had a reputation for being sort of cantankerous and not a great teammate, comes to a place and suddenly becomes a great teammate, who has figured out a way to motivate this team of undrafted players to do incredibly well in the playoffs, I think that has something to say about the coaching and about him too.
Yeah, him finding the place that was the best fit for him. My favorite Jimmy Butler in Philly story was his last series with Philly was the one where Kawhi Leonard hit the shot for the Raptors that bounced and bounced and bounced and bounced. The Sixers won game 2 of the series, and Brett Brown, the head coach, trying to pay him a compliment, says, "This was James Butler. That was the adult in the gym." And Butler, in response to that, said, "My name isn't James. It is literally Jimmy."
The other one you pulled up that was excellent was during the bubble season. And Charles Barkley said to him, "I have a question. You clearly have not made it to the barber in the bubble." And Jimmy Butler responded, "That's not a question."
He had these like very long dreadlocks at Media Day this year, knowing that that would be the photo that would be associated with him in headshots all year. He's been called kind of the biggest troll in the NBA. And there was this clip that circulated recently. I don't know if you heard it, Stefan. I intentionally hid it from you so that you wouldn't be able to hear it in advance because I wanted to hear your reaction if you had not heard it. So this is Jeff Teague on the Club 520 podcast telling the story of the famous practice incident. So Jimmy Butler wants out of Minnesota. He has kind of not been showing up. They're scrimmaging and he decides he wants to play. All of a sudden, he takes the backups and leads them to this blowout victory against the starters. I will let Jeff Teague pick it up from there.
Man, Jimmy going crazy. Y'all think that team can win without me? I'm him. Pay me. Pay me. Mind you, he ain't took off his Jordan warm-up yet, right? He finally takes it off. He got the Timberwolves shirt on, but he cut the Minnesota out so it's just chest. Wow. He cut the Minnesota out the shorts. It's just shorts. He out here with a hole in the middle of his shirt, on the middle of his leg. So I'm crying now. Yo, I'm crying. I'm like, yo, bro, crazy.
It's just chest, Stefan.
I think we had all heard the story of him willing the second team in those practices or in that practice, but that's fantastic. I mean, I'm going to cut wait, I have no logos on my shirt. I can't cut anything out right now, Josh.
Gabe Vincent, who was the star in Game 3, he went to UC Santa Barbara. I was curious, to see what kind of in his background suggested he was capable of doing this in the NBA. Scored 29 points 0 times in college. We mentioned it before. These are players who, in the G League, on the bench for the Heat, have developed into roles in some occasions that they haven't played maybe since high school. It's really fascinating to watch. And I think, you could argue that the fact that, Butler doesn't play every game during the regular season, they had to rotate a bunch of guys in. It kind of gives them the opportunity to stretch their legs a little bit. On the other hand, it would typically be a death sentence to be the 8th seed, to put yourself in position where, you have to come through the play-in. I don't think the Heat I don't think that's necessarily part of Heat culture and the master plan to just kind of scuffle along in the regular season. They've talked about, it allowed us to overcome adversity. And, we had a lot of close games. But the thing that'll be interesting to see as it looks like right now, if they make the finals, they're coming up against a team I wouldn't say it's exactly in their image, Stefan, but they've got the star, Jokic. Oh, but actually they have the other star, Jamal Murray. And they have role players like Bruce Brown, who's been amazing. They've got, veterans like Jeff Green. They've got a guy like Aaron Gordon, who's been on, was a star with the Magic, and now seems like he's in the perfect role for him. Like a team that seems to be fitting together as well as they are, but actually has been fully constituted the whole season, and nobody's particularly playing above their heads right now.
And that seems to be the difference between the Nuggets and the teams that have fallen by the wayside in the West or are about to fall by the wayside in the West. You mentioned this idea of role players being comfortable and willing to play that role. And one of the narratives with the Warriors this season was that the younger players were sort of chafing at not playing enough or not being deferred to more. And on the Lakers, the role players have sucked in this series, notably D'Angelo Russell, who, not necessarily a role player historically, but now he certainly is on a LeBron Austin Reeves team, I should say. And they've been terrible. And the Nuggets have that same story that they tell about how everyone knows their job, and someone like Aaron Gordon, who had much bigger roles on other teams in the past, is willing to do what it takes on this team. And someone like Aaron Gordon, who had bigger roles at previous stops in his career, is willing to sacrifice some of that now in Denver. That this seems to be the most well-balanced team. It doesn't feel like a super team, and certainly the Heat don't feel like a super team. But I guess when you have two stars like Jokic and Murray, who can trade off, as our friend Ben Golliver noted in a piece in the Washington Post, that's helpful. And that's what we saw over the weekend, where Murray scored 30 points. Where Murray scored 30 points in the first half of Game 3, was pretty quiet in the third quarter, and then Jokic took over in the fourth quarter. There didn't seem to be any fear that, oh my God, Jokic isn't playing well, and he picked up a fourth foul, and we have to sit him down for a lot of the third quarter. The Nuggets hung in there, stayed close, and Jokic comes in and just takes the game over in the end. That's a good team.
Yeah, and the player that I forgot to mention in the rundown of Nuggets role players is Kentavious Caldwell-Pope, who was kind of a key to the Lakers winning the title in the bubble season. They let him go in addition to, a bunch of other guys who were the role players who filled out that squad, and the Lakers totally fell apart. It's only been since the All-Star break when they got, the reinforcements who've been so good and the tail end of the regular season and the playoffs so far that they were kind of able to build themselves back up. I mean, Rui Hachimura has been great. He's been the one guy outside of the big three of Anthony Davis, LeBron James, and Austin Reeves, who has kind of helped carry them in these moments. I mean, a lot of the time we look at the teams that win and kind of reverse engineer or explain like, oh, they won because of, the Lakers. Those games have been close against the Nuggets. They succeeded against, obviously, the Warriors and the Grizzlies. And it was because they'd, put shooting around LeBron. It was because, they finally...
Right, they reconstituted the team late in the season, and it worked.
Yeah, exactly. I think what we've seen is, LeBron's mortality, him getting tired in the fourth quarter. The three-point shooting numbers in the fourth quarter have been atrocious. I think he missed his first 19 or something like that in the series. And, Kevin O'Connor was saying, not jokingly, on Twitter, the Lakers didn't get enough out of Austin Reeves. Bad process by LA to not feed Reeves with more shot creation opportunities. LeBron James should have deferred much more to Austin Reeves. I mean, this is the stage that he's in his career, and they've come up against a team that, like you said, doesn't need any. It doesn't particularly care which of their two stars is scoring at a particular moment, and also Jokic is kind of uniquely able to bend the game to his will. I mean, maybe not uniquely because Jimmy Butler does it in a similar way, but he's able to get Bruce Brown, KCP, And these other guys open looks, the kind of looks that that the guys who aren't able to create their own looks are able to maximize. And so, let's talk a little bit about Jokic before we go. Thomas Beller wrote a profile of him and a book excerpt that ran in Slate that has a bunch of great observations and moments. I lead the league in scratches, Jokic said in 2019. I'm always bleeding. I'm used to it. And Beller asked the Serbian basketball scout who discovered Jokic why. He says, I have no real explanation besides the fact that his skin is very sensitive.
He's got sensitive skin.
That's the kind of insight you can get from this podcast.
And you could spend, multiple podcasts talking about Jokic's personality and his background and his family and Serbia. He's so wonderfully unself-conscious, it seems. He talks about how he likes horses and he likes playing tennis.
The best sound is hearing horses eat. The best sound in the world.
That is the best sound in the world. Or how when he was a kid, he was fat, drank 3 liters of Coke every day, and had fatty cheese pies called bureks for breakfast. Liked playing 3-on-3 because he didn't have to play defense. And then you also see how he's just an exceptional human being when it comes to his instincts and his reactions and his, the physicality that we associate with Jokic as a lumpy guy that moves really slowly, when in fact what he has is this sort of brilliant kinesthetic ability to see the court, make those insane passes, and use his arms in ways with the basketball that other players just can't.
Yeah, one thing I've thought about is, he's a 7-footer, obviously, that is a huge factor in why and how he's able to shoot as well as he does, and how he's able to pass as well as he does. But it's not the only factor. Like he does things out there. I mean, that's kind of the whole shtick with him, is that he's the best passing big man in history because he passes like he's 6'2". So I've just been trying to think, what would Jokic be like, or how good would he be if he was 6'11", if he was 6'10", if he was 6'9"? Like how short? Like, and he still moved in the exact same way. Like, could we have like a 6'1" Jokic out there just kind of lumbering around? Or would he just be like the greatest player in EuroLeague history? Would it be the greatest player in like your gym history? We've never really seen anyone like him. And so it's kind of confounding to think about how all of these skills blend together and how much the center aspect of it. I mean, it's obviously it's the reason why he's the 2-time MVP, but I'm having a nice reverie thinking about 6'1" Jokic. Up next, Dave Zirin and Jesse Washington on Jim Brown.
It's time to reboot your credit card with Apple Card. Now, when you get a new Apple Card by May 31st, you can earn $75 back at Nike. Just spend $75 or more on qualifying purchases at Nike using Apple Card with Apple Pay within your first 30 days. Apple Card gives you unlimited daily cash back that you can automatically grow at 4.15% annual percentage yield when you open a high-yield savings account. Learn more about Apple Card in the Wallet app on iPhone. Apple Card subject to credit approval. Savings provided by Goldman Sachs Bank USA. Member FDIC and available to Apple Card owners subject to eligibility requirements. $75 daily cash valid only for new Apple Card accounts opened by May 31st, 2023. Qualifying purchases at Nike only within the U.S. Additional terms and limitations apply. Visit apple.co/Nike promo for important offer details.
One way to sum up Jim Brown, who died last week at 87, is to say that he was a bad motherfucker. Maybe the greatest college lacrosse player ever, a black man in the 1950s. Averaged 100 yards per game in the NFL, and, though he played only 9 seasons, set a career rushing record that stood for 2 decades. groundbreaking athlete activist, made love on screen with Raquel Welch. Another way to sum up Jim Brown? Repeat domestic abuser who cozied up to Donald Trump, whose behavior and politics were at odds with his image as a sports civil rights icon alongside Ali and Bill Russell and Kareem Abdul-Jabbar. We're joined now by two guests. Jesse Washington is a senior writer for ESPN's Andscape, formerly The Undefeated, where he wrote a 2017 piece titled Jim Brown Has No Time for Games. Welcome back to the show, Jesse.
Thanks for having me. It's good to be here.
Also with us is Dave Zirin, the sports editor of The Nation and the author of the 2018 biography, Jim Brown, Last Man Standing. Hey, Dave.
Hey, great to be here. Thanks for having me.
My first question for both of you is, what was your first thought when you heard that Jim Brown had died?
When I heard Jim Brown had died, I thought, job well done. He did a lot for America, and I strive to live a life of service. I think that can be our highest calling. And despite the ups and downs of his life, the many serious mistakes that he made, I think he had a positive impact on the lives of his fellow Americans.
Yeah, my first thought was Jim Brown didn't live a life. He lived 5 lives. I mean, entire books could be written about his athletic career alone. Entire books could be written about his political life alone. Entire books could be written about his Hollywood experience, not just acting, but an attempt to start what was really a revolutionary film company with Richard Pryor that went down in very dramatic flames. And then there's his work as someone who intervened in the toughest gangs, not just in Los Angeles, but around the country, inside and outside prisons, men's prisons, women's prisons. He did so much. And I would certainly make the case that the connection with Donald Trump was actually something that was consistent throughout his life. I mean, he endorsed Richard Nixon in 1968, and that doesn't make him like a John Bircher. What it was his politics. He believed in economic development. He believed in small-scale capitalism, really, as he showed through the black economic unions that he formed in the 1960s, connecting athletes with local communities. I don't want to go on too long because it's both of us here, but the legacy is profound, the complications are profound, and the life was profound. And I think it's a life that demands study. And one of the things that I have a problem with is in the aftermath, you're seeing either genuflection or people absolutely tearing him down. And I just think there's way too much there that's rich for us to have that simplistic an approach to this individual.
Jesse, Jim Brown wouldn't have been able to have the impact that he had if it wasn't for his incredible and in some ways impeccable athletic career. This was a short career. It was one that was astounding at the time. And a lot of times when we talk about an athlete from the past, the kind of legend gets inflated. But this is the guy who's the only player in NFL history to rush for 100 yards a game. It's a guy who was modern in his combination of speed and power. And it's a guy who, I think similar to Bill Russell, when you watch his highlights, it's not just this guy could have played in the era. It's that this guy would have defined any era that he played in.
For sure. I mean, Bill Belichick said he's the greatest football player who ever lived. So you could take it from him, or you could take it from the fact that he had an MVP season and played the entire year with a broken toe. I mean, come on now. Never missed a game. Come on. Like, it's really amazing what he did on the football field. And because his career was short, and he cut it short in an act of self-determination and defiance and refusal to bow down to a power structure when he was shooting a movie and he was going to be late for training camp and the owner tried to fine him or something. He said, cool, I'll retire and I'll go start this other life that Dave talked about. So, I mean, you're right. His impact on our country was really predicated on his stature and his accomplishments as an athlete. And I think that, they're both Mount Rushmore status.
Yeah. I mean, he's really sort of a Jim Thorpe kind of athlete. Was the best, arguably, at two disparate sports. at a time when an athlete of his upbringing and his race wouldn't be acknowledged as the best in those sports. And Jesse, and Dave, the standing up to the power structure is what is really interesting. We talk a lot about player empowerment these days, but what Brown did during his career and at the end of his football career was consistent with who he was. Before he told Art Modell, who was the owner of the Browns, that I'm offended that you're threatening to suspend and fine me because I'm going to be late for training camp, so I'm just going to quit. Before that, he was one of the players that led to the firing of the legendary Paul Brown, the coach of the team, the guy for whom the team was named. He stood up for fellow black players on the Browns in one incident, marching into the office of the head coach and saying, "You're not going to cut this guy," whom they had already cut. And 5 minutes later, the player is back on the field in training camp. He was definitely ahead of his time in creating this notion of athletes have rights and we need to be respected because we are your meal ticket.
Yeah, a couple things on that. He was the first modern superstar, and we should say that that's true without hesitation. He was also the first athlete to ever have an agent. And we have to keep in mind what the structure is like. Now, I think we rightly praise people like Lamar Jackson for operating without an agent. But operating with an agent then was, in fact, a revolutionary act of self-empowerment at a time where contracts were done in a very top-down way. But I'll take it another step, too. I think his work with the black economic unions that he started in the mid-1960s were a prerequisite to what's known as the Black Athletes Revolt in the late 60s and early 70s. And without the Black Athletes Revolt in the late 60s and early 70s, without Curt Flood, you don't have the massive opening up of the salary structure in free agency in the 70s and 80s. So one could make, I think, a very compelling case that without Jim Brown, you don't have generations of millionaire athletes.
There's a famous photo, Jesse, of the 1967 Cleveland Summit that was organized, I think, largely by Jim Brown. This meeting of men, including Bill Russell, including Kareem, that we kind of look back on now as one of the seminal moments of the civil rights movement, where they met with Ali to discuss with him his conscientious objector status during the Vietnam War. What do you see and what do you think about when you look at that photo and think about that moment?
I feel that photo has never been duplicated in sports history. I can't recall another gathering of the greatest athletes in one place for a purpose, for a cause, as revolutionary, as powerful, as important to, human rights and justice in this country as that photo. Like, I don't think it's been duplicated. And so, that was really the impetus for me sort of starting to write about Jim Brown when that anniversary was coming up, and I wanted to do a profile. And so I've spent a tiny fraction of the time on talking to Jim Brown and researching his career that Dave has, and all of the perspective and the knowledge that he has and that came out in his great biography is amazing, and I've relied on it a lot for my perspective on it. So I think that he can really add a lot to the importance of that meeting. But as a younger guy who sees, who is glad to see this resurgence in athlete activism in the 2000s after this apolitical period, I still don't think they've got to the point where Jim Brown gathered those guys together. I still don't think that we in this era have gotten to that point in that photo.
And yet, Dave, that photo reflected something more. They came to support Ali, yes, but part of what they were supporting was Ali's ability to make money as a boxer, because Jim Brown was motivated by being part of a consortium that had backed Ali that would profit from Ali being in the ring, even if it was just in the ring for the Army going on tour. There was an economic underpinning, economic motivation to what Jim Brown did at the Cleveland Summit that was consistent with his philosophy.
Yeah, I'd love to speak a little bit about the Cleveland Summit, the Ali Summit. First of all, I got to say it. Jesse Washington's writing about Jim Brown over the years has been fantastic. I'm not just saying that because he said it's something nice about the book. And what's great about Jesse's writing is that he understands the politics of Jim Brown. He understands the common thread of Jim Brown. He understands that this idea of small-scale capitalism in the black community was a wing of the black freedom struggle that Jim Brown represented. It's not just like he woke up one day and said, I'm going to endorse Richard Nixon, I'm a Republican. No, it was, for Jim Brown, it was always about strategy, about economic empowerment. And you had Richard Nixon making speeches about black power in 1968 and seeing it as a break from the, as Nixon put it, the welfarist 1930s. And Jim Brown really did connect with that. The one thing I'll say about the Cleveland Summit that really speaks to Jim Brown is I interviewed Brown about it and several of the people who were there. First of all, they went out there because of Jim Brown more than Muhammad Ali. He was the one who organized it. He was the one who called it. He was the one who was unassailable. When he called you, you went. The other thing about it was Jim Brown set up something backstage before they came out for that press conference where Muhammad Ali got to talk to all those athletes who were there. And a lot of those athletes were not down with Muhammad Ali not being in Vietnam, not being able, not fulfilling his main event contract at the time so they could, profit from that. And Ali just convinced everybody that he was on the side of right. Ali, according to Jim Brown, talked circles around everybody to the point of which when they came out for that press conference, they were united as one. And that was because of Muhammad Ali, and that was because of Jim Brown.
So at the height of his powers and fame, in 1968, there was this incident with the model Eva Bone Chin where she ends up either falling or being thrown by Jim Brown over a railing and off a balcony. It's one of many, many incidents of alleged, reported, and I think in some cases admitted domestic abuse by Jim Brown. And I think in a lot of the remembrances of Brown, there's been talk of him being a complex and complicated individual. And a lot of times when we say that, it's kind of code for this is a person who did great things and also terrible things. This is a person who abused women. I think a lot of times we say that about men who abused women, that they're complicated or that they're complex. It seems like, and you guys know better than me, and I'm going to defer to you on this, that it seemed like he wanted something from women or thought that he deserved something from women. And when he didn't get it, it could enrage him sometimes. What have you guys, and you guys have both written extensively about his, history with women, his history of abuse. What have you guys come to believe about, how we should think about Jim Brown and women?
Jim Brown's politics, I think, were very complicated. Anybody who endorses Richard Nixon and speaks at Huey Newton's funeral is going to have complicated politics. Jim Brown's relationships with women were not very complicated. Jim Brown believed in the question of his own masculinity very strongly. Masculinity is this common thread throughout his entire life. It's why he left the Cleveland Browns. In his speech, he said, I am not going to be infringed upon as a man and be treated this way by Art Modell. Therefore, I'm not coming back. And that's a common thread throughout his life. It's why he spent time in prison in his later years for a short period, because he felt like the judge was railroading him into community service for something he did not do, namely alleged abuse against his wife, who chose not to press charges. So even that, he was like, I'm not going to be treated like less than a man. I'll go to jail and go on a hunger strike rather than do community service. And I think that question of asserting his masculinity was something that was reflected very deeply and very toxically in his relationships with women. When he'd be challenged, there was alleged physical violence, and it's a real part of his history. It's also difficult to talk about because it's like, my goodness. We could have a deep discussion about this, get off the phone, and I'll put on the Off the Wall album. It's like how we reckon with allegations of abuse from people who come from a period where those things were seen very differently is a difficult thing to square with the individual. But at the same time, when you look at his, like, as you started talking about him as a bad motherfucker, it's like these are reverberations of that. of this idea that his will, his place in any relationship would not be challenged. And that would reflect itself in alleged abuse, according to certainly people with whom I spoke, police reports that I read, trials that took place. I mean, it's a lot. And Jim Brown dismissed this as being railroaded for being this kind of political figure. But when you have accusations that take place over the course of 35 years, it's very difficult to dismiss.
Yeah, I don't think they're allegations. I think Jim Brown beat women. Jim Brown also beat men. Several of his arrests were for physical violence. I think, a golf game went awry and someone got beat up. And I'll say this, I've interviewed a lot of people. I've interviewed a lot of dangerous people in my career. And when I sit down with Jim Brown and ask him a tough question, he is an extraordinarily intimidating person. And he was 80 years old. And he still looked like he would slap the taste out your mouth. Like he has that aura. And part of it is because you know that he's capable of it. And so he's absolutely, he beat his romantic partners. Let's not forget, he went to Hollywood and became a movie star at the dawn of the sexual revolution and indulged in that to the fullest. And in his autobiography, the longest chapter is about all the sex he had at his legendary house up at the Hollywood Hills. So he just believed that was his right, and everything sort of went from that. So when you couple that amount of sexual liberty that he took with his violent nature, period, that was a bad mix. I did not ask Jim Brown to address any of those allegations. I did ask his wife, Monica, and, it's very difficult to ask a woman who has been abused, who is married to her abuser, and it was in the past, And to be clear, he was not accused of putting his hands on Monica, but smashing the window of the car she was in when she accused him of infidelity. And then that led to the point that I'm really glad Dave brought up, which was this man went to jail instead of doing community service. I'll go sit in jail first, which I think really speaks a lot to his character. So, you asked Josh how we should think about Jim Brown and domestic abuse, and everybody thinks differently about it. I think that we should think it happened. He was an abuser, and that is part of his legacy. He spoke on it and accepted responsibility for it to a point in some of his public comments. And we have to include that in how we remember him, and everybody can come to their own conclusions. In my own opinion, it's a really unfortunate mark on his memory and legacy, but it does not outweigh the tremendous contributions he made for other people.
Yeah, if there's one thing I would add is when I interviewed Jim Brown, I did ask him about it. It was done with a lot of fear. And Jesse, I'm with you. I wouldn't have done it except for the fact that when I was talking to him, Ray Rice was all over the papers. And people were writing columns about why do the Cleveland Browns have this connection? Why does the NFL have this connection to Jim Brown if all of a sudden the NFL is saying, oh, we're against domestic abuse? And so there were a lot written about that. And Jim Brown was reading one of those columns when I was sitting with him. So how could I not say, what do you think about all this? And the reason I wasn't going to ask him about it was honestly a bit of an intimidation and fear factor. Jesse's not wrong about that, and I'll own that. But when I asked him about it, he didn't slap the taste out of my mouth or the yellow off my teeth. He smiled and shook his head and said, violence against women, shit. He just could not believe it was still following him at this point in his life, where at almost 80 years old, he was still having to deal with it. I thought that was an interesting response, a kind of eye roll and wariness, and not really an effort to sort of engage with why, in the case of Ray Rice, it was starting to become this very, very vibrant issue in how the NFL was speaking about these things. I'll also just throw in because we are talking about how intimidating it was to interview him. When he spoke about his two youngest kids, he was a teddy bear. And honestly, when he spoke about his fallout with Richard Pryor, he started to even tear up a little bit. And it's just, if you ever read Richard Pryor's book, his memoir about how ugly that breakup was, and if you read Jim Brown's book and what he said to me about how incredibly close he felt to Pryor, you can see why it would sting to the degree it did after all these years.
Jesse, you spent time with Jim Brown in the kind of tail end of his life, where he was still going around the country for his American Foundation, still preaching about, the need to stop gang violence, and meeting with Donald Trump. And it's a period of his life that I think you've thought a lot about. And so just curious, as we wrap up here, what did you see and hear from Brown when you spent that time with him, and as you've been kind of following him in the tail end of his life and career?
Yeah, he took a lot of heat for that. And what I saw was Jim Brown being Jim Brown and refusing to change his approach for anybody just because of some perceptions. So Jim Brown met with every president since Lyndon Johnson except Obama. Obama did not meet with him, probably because of Brown's history with women. And so he voted for Hillary Clinton. And then when Trump got in office, Jim Brown had a program that helped countless people, AmeriCan. And AmeriCan needed funds. Trump had funds. So I'm going to go talk to Trump. And, it was the interviews that I did with him were really amazing. And it was just so consistent with how he operated. Dave, one of the things that I really drew on in this research was when Brown told you about, his opinions of Dr. King versus direct action. Mm-hmm. And he told you, I didn't think much of Dr. King, and he said, I'm not trying to put Dr. King down, but if you think about the majority of the rhetoric, and this is Jim Brown's quotes, it's about what's being done to us. It doesn't have damn near anything that says what we're going to do for ourselves. So Jim Brown was like, I'm going to go get this, and that's an uncomfortable, that places a lot of the Black community and the Black political folks in an uncomfortable spot, because we have been falsely accused of being our own biggest problem. But that's not at all what Jim Brown was saying. And so, I respected that he was like, I can go get some money from my program from Donald Trump and help people. Now, should he have gone there with Kanye to the Oval Office? No. That was disappointing. And he was being used. And I am not sure whether the Trump administration ever came through and gave AmeriCan the money. I'm not sure. I really hope that they did, but I don't know. But I don't think that Jim Brown deserves to be criticized for trying to help people by using funds from the Trump administration.
Yeah, I don't know about the AmeriCan funding. That's a great question. I did try to find out and came up against several brick walls in that regard. It's so interesting because we're having this discussion on the same day that Ice Cube has gone viral for saying, again, something he said during the elections, that Black people should not support the Democratic Party and that there's more space for economic growth through the Republican Party. And I just think it's like we're being blind historically to not realize that that's always been, or at least in the last 50 years at least. I mean, this isn't so much about Booker T. Washington. This is much more coming out of a wing of the Black Power movement in the 1960s about how to function and how to build community resources. Now, we can disagree with that, and I wrote very critically about the meeting with Trump, even as a way to fulfill Brown's objectives. But they were not done just so he could get on camera and feel relevant. He had an operation that he was going to do. But one of the reasons why I was like, oh my God, I really need to write this book is because people were acting like he sold out his civil rights movement bona fides by going in with Trump. And it's like, civil rights movement bona fides, he was against what King was doing. He had a different method, but it speaks to the power of Jim Brown as a symbol, that Jim Brown was there and invited by Coretta Scott King to sit in the first two rows at Dr. King's funeral. Keep in mind, there were U.S. senators who were outside the church and were not allowed in or couldn't get in or didn't have a seat. And yet Jim Brown was an invite of Coretta Scott King. It just speaks to the fact that even though he diverged strongly from that method of civil rights movement, supporting the Democratic Party, Jesse Jackson, all of that, despite the fact that he diverted from that, his power was really strong. Jesse Jackson wrote a glowing obituary of Jim Brown, somebody who was on really a different side in terms of but at the same time, Reverend Jackson saw him as being on the same side as well for a larger purpose, just different methods of how to get there.
Jim Brown demanded his rights as a football player. He demanded to be paid. He would not back down when the owner said, you got to be here. So it is consistent, Jesse and Dave, with what he said in 1963 before he quit football that you quote in one of your pieces, Dave, when he was asked about Dr. King. He said, I for one will not march down the street and kneel and pray for my rights. That is just not my shit.
Yeah, that's what he said. That's right. And I guess if there's one last thing I'd say is that this is an incredibly difficult time for his family. And it's really difficult to even try to talk this through, given everything that's being said and everything that's being done. I really appreciate Jesse's lucidity. I don't know if I'm sharing it at the moment, because this is not easy for me to sort of parse through what I'm not going to say at all that the instances with women are complicated and tangled, but the life is very complicated and tangled, and I'm going to hold to that.
Yeah, I'm thankful for what Jim Brown did for the Black community and for all of those, regardless of race, who had challenging circumstances economically, socially, all of that. And then it is not for me to judge his transgressions. They should be recorded, they should be acknowledged, and then everybody can make their peace with it. We're all human beings with failings, some great, some small, some in the public eye and some not. So not at all to minimize or make excuses for Jim Brown's mistakes and crimes. There are crimes in there. But it's a life that, as Dave said, should absolutely be understood in full. His book is a great place to start, and just a titanic figure in American history that must be remembered and studied and understood.
Jesse Washington is a senior writer for ESPN's Andscape. Jesse, thank you so much for coming on the show.
Thank you.
And Dave Zirin, sports editor at The Nation, the author of the biography Jim Brown, Last Man Standing. Thank you, Dave.
Oh, it's great to be on. Thanks so much.
We'll post links to works by Dave and Jesse on our show page. Next, we'll talk to Defector's Maitreyi Anantharaman about Brittney Griner, the Las Vegas Aces, and the WNBA.
I'm Jonathan Braylock.
I'm Dra Milligan.
And I'm James III. And we're the hosts of Black Men Can't Jump in Hollywood. It's a comedic podcast that reviews films with leading actors of color and analyzes them in the context of race and Hollywood's diversity issues.
Yeah. Listen to new episodes on Mondays. Find us wherever you get your podcasts.
I don't care where you get them. I just want you to listen.
Don't threaten the people. We need them to listen.
Oh, okay. Sorry, guys. Listen to us.
Hey. Yeah, put on a happy voice.
What more can I say? You know what it is.
Black men can't jump.
At the end of your first year, Discover credit cards automatically double all the cash back you've earned. That's right. Everything you earned doubled. All the cash back from eating at your favorite soup dumpling restaurant doubled. All the cash back from that trip where you sort of learned to snowboard also doubled. And the best part, you don't have to do anything ridiculous to get it. Nope, Discover does it automatically. Seriously, though, see terms and check out for yourself at discover.com/match.
On Friday in Los Angeles, Phoenix Mercury center Brittney Griner scored 18 points in a 94-71 loss to the Los Angeles Sparks. Didn't get the dub, she said after the game. I'm sure that Griner cared about the result, but didn't really care. It was her first official game in 579 days since the last game of the 2021 WNBA Finals. In between, Griner spent nearly 300 days in captivity in Russia after authorities there said they found vape cartridges containing cannabis oil in her luggage. She was released in December in a prisoner swap for a convicted Russian arms dealer. Maitreyi Anantharaman is a staff writer at Defector, where she covers women's basketball. Welcome back to the show.
Thanks for having me back.
I think we can agree that this was the most eventful and news-filled beginning to a WNBA season since the first WNBA season in 1997. But let's start with Griner. Since her release, she had to first deal with recovering from the ordeal. She chose to advocate for other detainees in Russia very publicly. She interacted with President Biden at the White House Correspondents' Dinner. She attended the Met Gala in New York. She also managed to get into shape to play basketball again, which was by no means a given. On Sunday, in an emotional home debut in Phoenix, she didn't get the dub again, but had 27 points, 10 rebounds, and 4 blocked shots. The whole story is at once tragic, uplifting, and remarkable.
Yes, she looked excellent, and that's not something I take for granted because I wasn't sure what version of her we were going to see. Like you said, what her conditioning was going to be like, what her shot was going to look like. It's so different from, coming back from like an ACL tear where you've been on some careful training, nutrition regimen the whole time. This is really building all the way back up. And I thought she picked up pretty much where she left off. If this is 70% or 80% of Brittney Griner, then wow, that's really good news. And the team needs her badly. They're not letting her ease back in. I was watching her first home game back on Sunday evening, which I thought, again, she looked great in. And they did this big spoken word production and special dance intro about how much they love her and care about her safety. And I was cracking up because the whole team is like, hey, we know you just got out of a Russian detention camp and you're healing mentally and physically, and these scars may never truly leave you, and you're picking up the pieces from the most traumatic time of your life. That being said, if you could just do us a quick favor and get us like 30 points on 10 of 12 shooting, that would be really awesome. Thanks. Because Diana Taurasi was like shooting them out of the game. They couldn't get anything else going outside of Griner. So it's a good sign for the Mercury that she's playing well because, yeah, it means this healing process is back on track, that she feels good, and also they don't have a backup plan.
It's really amazing that she's not only back playing, but playing this well. We obviously didn't know what was going to happen, but it was certainly a possibility that she would never play professional basketball again. And she's clearly not in peak shape by her own admission. She's not like moving amazingly well out there, but she's blocking shots. She knocked down a 3. She's like looking really solid from the mid-range. And as you said, it's this funny kind of juxtaposition of the kind of cultural and social impact of her. Billie Jean King is in the stands. Dawn Staley is there. Magic Johnson is there. There's not really anything mundane about her game because of her extraordinary size and ability, but just the kind of mundanity of she puts up a great stat line and her team loses. And so I guess I'm kind of curious where you think her and the Mercury are going to go from here. They're 0-2. There's this kind of great feeling about her, but I just wonder, how long is the attention going to be on her? How long is the attention going to be on the team? They're obviously not going to be on national television twice every weekend, but is there going to be a kind of return to normalcy with Brittney Griner and with her team this year at some point?
Yeah, you have to imagine that that's what she wants as a professional athlete is to just get back to normal and play games. I think Brittney Griner has this reputation as a defensive great because she's a tall center who, like you said, blocks a lot of shots. But I think she's a tremendously important offensive player to them. If you ask me to give you a specific shot to call the most unguardable in the WNBA, I think it's that elbow jumper of hers. I think the Mercury roster is sort of weird. I don't think it has the depth to really compete. But I think Brittney Griner gives them a good floor. And if you remember the team she last played on, which was the 2021 Mercury, they didn't have a great regular season, but they got into the playoffs and she took them to the finals and they made a run. And so I sort of think that, yes, the attention is going to die down a little bit and you know, maybe that'll be constructive and helpful actually to just kind of play out the nerves and get really going into the season.
It's almost as if they're getting it all out of the way immediately. I mean, the vice president was at the game in Los Angeles. Griner stood for the national anthem, which was a news cycle because she had stopped doing so in 2020, and answered the questions about that incredibly well. She said, one thing that's good about this country is our right to protest. You have a right to be able to speak out, question, to challenge, and do all of these things. After what I went through, it just means a little bit more to me now. She's handled everything that's been thrown at her in the months since her release. And that to me feels like the most remarkable thing. You said, Josh, that there was no guarantee that she was ever going to play professional basketball again. And she is dealing with every sort of question, both on and off the court, that she could possibly face at the beginning of this season. And that's good for her, we hope, and also good for the WNBA.
Yeah, and this from someone who I didn't really remember being a, big media superstar. She wasn't like always in front of cameras. She was always kind of soft-spoken. And so I agree, it's impressive to be able to manage all of that noise and also be playing as well as she is right now.
The other big story in the WNBA this first week is the suspension of Las Vegas Aces coach Becky Hammon and the sanctions given to the team, all as fallout from allegations from De'Arica Hamby, who had been a long-tenured player for the Aces, who ended up being traded from the team after she became pregnant, and said that essentially the team had made things so uncomfortable for her that the team had, done to her what happens to so many women in so many industries, said, how dare you become pregnant, essentially, that, it made it so that she had to leave. Maitreyi, the league has been kind of, I guess, quasi-transparent or opaquely transparent. There's still a lot that we don't know about what was said and what was done. Kind of the most, specific allegations came from an Instagram post by Hamby in January, and then Becky Hammon's press conference, where she talked more openly about what was alleged than maybe the league had said in its own report. Can you kind of walk us through Hammon's response and what you think is going on here?
Yeah, we don't exactly know what was said, but the result of the investigation indicates who was saying it. And Becky Hammon received that 2-game suspension to start the season. And her press conference, I thought it was interesting. She sort of just said, you know what, this is a business. We had a good relationship. I never like to give anyone that news, but we have a team. It was funny because she was being accused of this callousness, really, and she had a funny quote, or funny to me quote, where she just said, we could get 3 bodies for this one contract, which I don't think really helped her case of seeming more understanding or empathetic. But it kind of just seems like Becky Hammon's saying, you know what, nothing untoward happened. I just had to make a decision. And she said, look at the players we brought in. We brought in Candace Parker. Anyone would make this trade, anyone make this trade to free up the cap space. And so, it's true. It's an ugly part of the business. But again, we don't know what was said. De'Arica Hamby has said in her Instagram post that basically the comments were to the effect that she had let down the team, that she hadn't held up some end of the deal, basically that there was certain language that you probably wouldn't hear if someone just got injured, right?
Yeah, she wrote, "I was told that I didn't hold up my end of the bargain because no one expected me to get pregnant in the next 2 years. Did the team expect me to promise not to get pregnant in exchange for the contract extension?" So we don't know how explicit Becky Hammon was. It sounds like it was explicit enough in the context of a workplace issue and what's appropriate to tell an employee who has gotten pregnant. And there's more than that too, though, right? Maitreyi, because the WNBA Players Association wasn't happy with the punishment here, the suspension and a rescinded draft pick for the Aces. And there's also there were some business implications to the punishment. Some allegations that the Aces were negotiating sort of side deals for players that might have been circumventing the WNBA's salary cap.
Yeah, the news that this impermissible benefits investigation was going on, it came out sort of separately, but you can kind of figure out that the two are linked because Hamby said in her Instagram post something to the effect of, "There were promises made to me that were not kept." And so I think that's sort of what got people looking into, okay, what were those promises? The reporting, and this was specifics of this were not mentioned in that WNBA press release announcing the result of the investigation, but the specifics are like basically an Aces player's agent would get a phone call from someone with the club saying, "Okay, here, let's work out an extension. Also, in 5 minutes, you're going to get another call from someone who's going to offer you like a fake sponsorship, and then you should accept that." And so it was this kind of under the table payment scheme that the league was investigating to see if that was something they were doing to lure free agents.
That's like some college sports shit.
Yeah, it was very dramatic. And so the investigation did say we didn't have any evidence that happened in the last free agency. If it had, I mean, there was going to be sort of a time crunch here because the investigation basically ran up to right when the season started. And if you had these players who were signed, on illegal terms, then there's going to be this whole contract mess. So I guess, they weren't Candace Parker, Alicia Clark. They were not part of the under the table scheme. But something was happening because, yes, the Aces were fined or had their first round pick rescinded, and so that's sort of what that was about. So it was kind of a dual punishment for the violation of the impermissible benefits rules and also a respect in the workplace standard that Hammon violated.
You've written in the past, Maitreyi, about how in the WNBA actually trying to win or caring is a competitive advantage. And given the really restrictive salary cap in the league and the rules on, for instance, charter flights, the amount of money that you need to throw towards securing a competitive advantage over other teams is really minuscule. I mean, when Joe Tsai was found to have illegally provided charter flights for his team, it's like, they're fined $500,000. I mean, like, big whoop for that guy. He's a billionaire. Who cares? With the Aces, Candace Parker and Alicia Clark, maybe there wasn't evidence, and I have no reporting on this to suggest that anything illegal was done. But they are making less money and salary this year than they did with their teams last year. And so I guess we can say this, is that if there is a league that's ripe for under the table payments or impermissible benefits, given the just completely restrictive salary structure, it would be the WNBA.
Yeah, and I think a theme of free agency was that certain owners were getting a lot of return on the investment they made, even in pretty obviously legal things like building a nice practice facility or, having fancy free agent wine and dine type dinners. And so I think that's sort of going to be the next ownership arms race already. The Aces just debuted their brand new Aces specific practice facility. They don't share it with anyone else. The Storm are building one. I know Matt Ishbia, who just bought the Suns and Mercury, and he made a pretty big swing when he bought the Suns, and seems like now that their season's over, he's going to turn his attention to the Mercury. He just did an interview where he was like, yeah, I kind of want to spend money on this too.
I mean, I said this in jest before, but it is exactly like college sports, where you can't spend money on players, so you make a fancy practice facility with a water slide or whatever. I mean, Matt Ishbia is known, before he became the Suns owner, for splashing out tens of millions of dollars to Michigan State, where he went to school, so they could fancy up their facilities. I mean, there's no better example of how these players are underpaid, or that the owners, at the very least, could afford to pay so much more in player salaries.
Right. So it's really that the owners should be the ones funding the entire league, as opposed to this overstructure of the WNBA commissioner's office dictating how limiting salaries have to be. The money exists. And the reality of the WNBA and other sports is that no one ever said these had to be profitable leagues. If you have owners like Matt Ishbia and the Aces owners, the Mark Davis and Joe Tsai in New York, let them spend. Create a league where that is possible. Do you think at some point the WNBA recognizes this reality, that if we allow these billionaires to open their checkbooks, this will be a better league? And most important, the players will be compensated fairly at a level that the market clearly is starting to demand.
Well, a league is just the owners. And so, you have, yes, a faction of owners who do want to spend, who do want to invest in this, but you definitely also do have the sort of older faction who's like, nope, we can just kind of keep things the same as they were. And so maybe that'll swing. This kind of spendy group is a newer class of owners, and so maybe they need to kind of build their power and see. But the league is fundamentally just the rich people, and so when the rich people change, that's when the league will change.
We'll get into some of the larger issues with the league and roster cuts in our Slate Plus segment in a moment. But just before we wrap up this segment, there is a connection to the Brittney Griner story here, which is players going abroad to make more money than they're able to make in the WNBA. We have seen the numbers have gone down in terms of players playing internationally, but all of this stuff is connected.
Maitreyi Anantharaman is a staff writer at Defector. She writes about women's basketball and other stuff. She's going to stick around for the bonus segment. Maitreyi, thank you so much for coming on the show.
Thanks for having me.
There's a reckoning happening in women's soccer in the U.S.
Tonight, the world of professional women's soccer is turned upside down.
It began with a few brave players who decided to speak out. Their decision forever changed the game. This is their story.
This is about safety in our own lives and our bodies.
The whole system is screwed up.
From Religion of Sports and PRX, I'm Brianna Scurry, and this is Counterattack.
Women's sports are powerful. They deserve respect. They are the future.
Listen now on Amazon Music.
And now it is time for Afterballs, sponsored by Bennett's Prune Juice, endorsed by Kenny Sailors, who says it was okay. I mentioned Gabe Vincent scoring 29 points in Game 3 earlier, 29 points 0 times in his college career with the UC Santa Barbara Gauchos. His senior year, he was the 4th leading scorer at UCSB. Not exactly screaming NBA star there. The 3rd leading scorer was Jalen Canty, most recently been playing in Israel and Mexico. The second leading scorer was Leland King, who started his college career at Brown University, then transferred to Nevada before playing at UCSB his senior year. I don't see anything about Leland King playing professionally since he was in the Bosnian second division in 2019. And finally, the leading scorer and star of those gauchos was Max Heidegger. He is 15th on the UCSB Gauchos all-time scoring list. Jewish, gone on to play in Israel, Germany, Turkey, and Spain, all in less than 3 years. He is currently playing for Baskonia in Spain's ACB and recently became the first player in league history to put up 25 points and 5 assists in less than 20 minutes in a single game. So, possible starter for the Heat in next year's final. Also, his father, Klaus, finished second overall in the 1977 Skiing World Cup. Multi-talented athletic family.
He also wrote Being in Time. So there's that.
Triple threat. Stefan, what is your Max Heidegger?
The DC State High School baseball title game was played on Sunday at the Washington Nationals Youth Baseball Academy. State anything sounds funny when you're talking about DC, because it's not a state, but that's what the organization that oversees championships involving public, charter, and private schools inside our little district is called, the DC State Athletic Association. This year's state tournament included 6 privates, 2 publics, and 1 charter. The finalists were the number 2 seed, the private all-boys school St. Albans, where students wear ties and go to chapel, and number 4 seed Jackson Reed, the 2,600 student public school that my daughter attended and where racist Woodrow Wilson was booted as the name last year. Behind a 3-hitter by a D1 bound pitcher, the private school kids won 6-1. Not a surprise, private schools in DC recruit heavily, play on swanky turf fields, and splurge on coaches, travel, and equipment. We've talked on this show about the Jackson Reed basketball team's run of state championship losses to private Sidwell Friends and others, and baseball is not that much different. Jackson Reed has reached the last 6 state finals, an impressive feat given the privates' advantages, but has won just once. The story in the city competition, though, is just a little bit different. As our friend Dave McKenna has covered over the years in Defector, the Washington Post, the Washington City Paper, and elsewhere, Dave loves this story. The Jackson Reed, nay Wilson baseball team possesses what is surely one of the most absurd records in secondary school sports. The Tigers have won every public school league championship since 1993. 29 in a row, 30 if you count 2021 when Jackson Reed didn't lose a league game in a COVID-abbreviated season, but the DC Interscholastic Athletic Association decided not to hold a tournament. And in those 3 decades, the Tigers have lost exactly 1 league game. 1 in 1999 to Dunbar, 5-4. The losing pitcher for the Tigers that day managed St. Albans on Sunday. The Tigers have won around 270 games in a row against fellow DC public schools. Their record since the start of the championship run is around 350-1. But no one celebrates or even really enjoys the streak, because what it really reflects are DC's racial and economic disparities and the decline of baseball in the inner city. Jackson Reed's dominance begins with its size. Its enrollment is 3 times that of any other DC public high school. The school is also whiter. Overall, DC public school enrollment is 65% black and 12% white. Jackson Reed is almost 40% white, and the 88-year-old school draws from the city's wealthiest neighborhoods. When it comes to baseball, that all matters. Tigers players have suburban advantages: Little League from the jump, summer camps, their own off-season travel team. To fund equipment, uniforms, a preseason trip to the Dominican Republic, and more, baseball team parents pay dues of $550 per season. Some donate hundreds more, while a few players are on scholarship. Remember, this is a public school. Even if it's grass and rutted and the team has to maintain it itself, Jackson Reed has its own field. It's across the street from the school in a federal park that, I digress, in the decades following the Civil War was a predominantly black neighborhood that was razed as whites moved into new swaths of single-family homes in expanding D.C. Players on Jackson Reed's only current city rival, the 600-student public magnet School Without Walls, which has a similar racial and economic profile, take public transportation across town to practice, as Spencer Nussbaum of the Washington Post detailed in a nice story this month. I watched the Jackson Reed Walls regular season game last month. A couple of my former Scrabble players play for Walls, and I've got some friends on Jackson Reed too. Walls, nicknamed the Penguins, came close to ending the Tiger streak. Entering the top of the sixth and final inning, it was getting dark, the teams were tied 1-1. Nail-biting time. Jackson Reed, though, scored 3 runs and closed out a 4-1 win. 2 weeks later, in the city championship game, it was Tigers 6, Penguins nothing. Jackson Reed outscored its other city public school opponents this season 251-3, winning every game by mercy rule. Some final scores: 30-1, 25-0, 24-0 twice, 23-0, and 22-0. That's just sad for DC, for DC public schools, and for baseball. The Nationals Academy, which opened in 2014, was supposed to help grow the sport in non-white parts of DC, like the one where it's located. An all-black team did win the DC Little League tournament a few years back, but it hasn't trickled up to high schools, at least not in big enough numbers to threaten Jackson Reed's dominance, and who knows if it ever will. For the Tigers players, the streak is a point of pride, but at this point, mostly a sword of Damocles. After Sunday's game, one parent told me that his son said he'd rather lose in the state final to one of the private schools than be part of the team that blows the streak against one of the public ones.
Well, that's great. And I think if the quote-unquote success were to trickle up, what would likely happen, or maybe is already happening, you can tell me, is that those, players would go to Jackson Reed. Sort of like in DC high school football. Ever since I've been here, the tradition has always been that there's like one school that's like the school that's good at football, and all the good players just go there.
It's hard because you can't just go to Jackson Reed. It is zoned. There are boundaries. Transfers do get in. We see that in basketball, particularly, where Jackson Reed, because again of its size, usually dominates the city side of the sport. But in baseball, the field kind of sucks. The program does have to scuffle a little bit. They've got huge advantages over every other school in the city, every other public school in the city. But that really doesn't make up in a sport like baseball for the ability to play on great fields and to travel at will, and to have a huge roster of coaches. In the city last year, the city tore down the batting cage at Fort Reno, the public park where Jackson Reed plays. And the kids actually had to protest and brought it up with the mayor, and the batting cage was rebuilt. So it's those kind of little indignities that even plague the biggest school in the city. And for all of Jackson Reed's success, and Wilson before it, they've only had one major league player, Manny Burris, who played parts of 7 seasons from 2008 to 2016, and whose kid now plays for the Jackson Reed Tigers.
That is our show for today. Our producer is Kevin Bendis. To listen to past shows and subscribe or just reach out, go to slate.com/hangup. You can email us at hangup@slate.com. And don't forget to subscribe to the show and rate and review us on Apple Podcasts. For Stefan Fatsis, I'm Josh Levine. Remember Zelmo Beatty, and thanks for listening. At the end of your first year, Discover credit cards automatically double all the cash back you've earned. That's right. Everything you earned doubled. All the cash back from eating at your favorite soup dumpling restaurant doubled. All the cash back from that trip where you sort of learned to snowboard also doubled. And the best part, you don't have to do anything ridiculous to get it. Nope, Discover does it automatically. Seriously though, see terms and check out for yourself at discover.com/match.
I'm Jonathan Braylock.
I'm Gerard Milligan.
And I'm James III. And we're the hosts of Black Men Can't Jump in Hollywood. It's a comedic podcast that reviews films with leading actors of color and analyzes them in the context of race and Hollywood's diversity issues.
Yeah. Listen to new episodes on Mondays. Find us wherever you get your podcasts.
I don't care where you get them. I just want you to listen.
Don't threaten the people. We need them to listen.
Oh, okay. Sorry, guys. Listen Listen to us.
Yay! Yeah, put on a happy voice.
What more can I say? You know what it is.
Black men